Hello everyone and welcome to the latest MDPI webinar on land, which is entitled Cultural Landscapes, Old and New Challenges for Sustainability. And it is chaired by Professor Stefan Hotes and Professor Tomohiro Ichinose. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is the first webinar of a series that is based in special issues and sections from our Lands Journal. So please, if you are interested in submitting your paper to the special issue related to this webinar, check the webinar's webpage. We will have several speakers today and a discussion at the end, so please type your questions in the Q&A box that is below your screen, and they will be discussed at the end of the session. I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be posted soon in the webinar's webpage as well. So now I'd like to introduce our chairs. Professor Stefan Hotes studies how ecosystems and people interact, focusing on wetlands, agricultural areas, and forests. The purpose of his research is to find sustainable development pathways for cultural landscapes that take the resilience of social ecological systems into account. Professor Hotes heads the Laboratory of Applied Landscape Ecology at the Faculty of Science and Engineering at Chuo University in Tokyo, Japan. Professor Tomohiro Ichinose conducts research on ecological network planning methods in cities, landscape changes in suburban and rural areas, and the population and aging problem in remote areas of Japan. He's professor at the Faculty of Environment and Information Studies at Keio University in Shonan Fujisawa campus, Fujisawa in Japan. And now I hand over the floor to our chairs, and to all of you, please enjoy the webinar.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you very much to MDPI for hosting this event. And so let me start with the introductory slides. So welcome to everybody also from my side to our webinar on the topic of cultural landscapes. I'm one of the co-chairs, obviously. There's Tomohiro Ichinose from Keio University also, and we both serve also as guest editors for the special issue in the journal Land with the same title, Cultural Landscapes. And if you have any manuscripts that would fit the scope of sustainability of cultural landscapes, we would be happy to hear from you and consider them for inclusion in this special issue. Yeah, with this, I would already like to hand over to Tomohiro for the next part of the introduction.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. So my name is Tomohiro Ichinose, Keio University, Japan. And also, I'm a president of Japanese Association of Rural Planning. So we would like to provide a brief overview of the motivation for organizing the event and of the aims we hope to contribute to. The photo on this slide shows a rural landscape in Germany. It has been studied in several interdisciplinary research projects aimed at understanding the interaction between environment and the socio-economic factors that determine whether the area, the community living in it can be considered sustainable. Similar studies have also been carried out in Japan, where the term Satoyama is used to refer to traditional rural landscape. At the beginning, let us define what we mean when we use the term cultural landscape. For our purpose today, we define cultural landscape as any area that has been altered from its natural state to cater to human needs. This includes landscape dominated by agriculture and forestry, as well as settlement located in them. It also includes urban area where more than half of the global population is now living, and some countries reported more than 80% of its people living in cities. The resources that we need in terms of food, housing, raw materials, and energy originate largely from cultural landscape, and much of the waste we produce in various forms end up in these areas too. So this broad definition implies that about half of the Earth's terrestrial areas are cultural landscapes. The map indicates levels of human impact, but this information can also be used as a rough indicator for the location of cultural landscapes. Links to agriculture and to the spatial distribution of the human population are recognizable. Challenges for sustainability of the integrated ecological, social, and economic systems we live in are not new. Systematic account of such issues can be traced in the literature to at least 300 years before present. With the acceleration of population growth and resource consumption rates, the frequency and the urgency of calls for the effective responses to the challenges have increased. The next, Stefan, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I take over from here, and one of the most recent global attempts to get hold of our interactions with our environment is the global assessment of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This platform was established formally in 2012 to assess knowledge, build capacity, strengthen the knowledge foundations, support policy, and communicate and engage. And we will have a presentation on this particular topic that was provided by Professor Dr. Joseph Zettele, but he unfortunately could not join us today. But we were very lucky that Professor Marie Stenseke from Gothenburg University in Sweden agreed to step in for him. And so we will have this presentation nevertheless. And thanks a lot to the great flexibility and spontaneous saying yes to taking over for Joseph here. And I think this shows in a nice way that we already are a very good kind of network here in terms of stakeholders that deal with sustainability issues. And yeah, so that is, the report was published in or adopted in 2019. And yeah, so we will hear more about that soon. Then we have these global assessments. We had the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment earlier. Now we have the global assessment of IPBES. And the question is, what do we all as stakeholders in this picture need to do? How can we work with what comes out of these international assessments? And the question there is about stakeholder networks. And one of the networks is the open-ended network of IPBES stakeholders. And that will be introduced by Dr. Flore Lafayette-Michaud of IUCN and Professor Stenseke. And yeah, that will be another presentation. And then we move on to yet another presentation that will be given by Yesenia Hernandez from Mexico. And there we will have another more focused look on the way that we as humans interact with cultural landscapes. And yeah, in that context, also the conceptual framework of IPBES will play some role where, to my knowledge, really for the first time, it has been there has been the attempt to integrate not only scientific knowledge, but also actively include indigenous and local knowledge, and address the idea that what we do as humans depends a lot on worldviews, on values that we have. And yeah, that we need all that as background information, and we need to be aware of that when we talk about strategies for becoming more sustainable. Then we have another presentation on one stakeholder network that is specifically addressing the issue of cultural landscapes. The Satoyama, as a Japanese term referring to cultural landscapes, was already mentioned, and there is a Satoyama initiative. And Dr. Maiko Nishi from the United Nations University is going to give a presentation on the international partnership for the Satoyama initiative. And from that, we can learn a lot about how stakeholder networks in relation to cultural landscapes have already been working over the past decade. We then move on to two case studies. And the first one will be presented by Professor Brice Saint-Saëns from Abomey-Calavi University in Benin in West Africa. And then we have another case study also on cultural landscapes in the Philippines that will be presented by Professor Macandog from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. So that is the flow of presentations for today. And I would like to use the last 2 slides of the presentation to introduce the basic ideas or the background of why we are holding this webinar and what we are hoping to achieve with this. So Tomohiro already mentioned that cultural landscapes and the way that we as humans interact with these landscapes involve challenges that are not new. We have had to deal with the question of where we get our food from, where we get raw materials, or we get our housing materials from, since humanity existed. And so that is not new. But we certainly are experiencing now over the past decades an acceleration in, well, human population growth and higher consumption rates, and that our activities are changing the landscapes that we're living in, and that we have as important drivers of change issues like land use intensification and urbanization. But we also see in some areas land abandonment. Japan is probably the global leader in that aspect, where demographic change and the fact that people are moving more to the cities and fewer people living in the countryside also leads to land abandonment. And so we have these interconnected drivers that can have very contrasting effects, and that is posing a challenge for the maintenance of cultural landscapes. We also have climate change affecting these landscapes in various ways. And we are aware of that, the man-made aspect of climate change for now at least 30 years. And that is also contributing to land degradation in many areas. And for the past year, we've now had a new situation where we globally have been in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has also created new impacts on cultural landscapes that mean both problems with maintaining them, but also possibly opportunities, because we see, at least in Japan here, that people are considering moving back to rural areas, partly motivated by this pandemic and the idea that living in the countryside may be safer than living in a big city. And so we have various responses to these challenges that we are facing. Many of them have been based on technology, on technical solutions, but we increasingly have had discussions about different ways of addressing these challenges, of looking for nature-based solutions, and that is also one of the major topics that we should address. So for our discussion today, the general question is basically whether, with all these changes that are happening and lifestyles changing towards more modern, often more urban lifestyles, whether these landscapes that have developed through traditional land use management techniques can still be maintained. And then more specifically, the question of what international assessments, like the ones being produced through IPBES, can help in this, how they can help in this process, how they can help us with recognizing planetary boundaries or regional boundaries that we should not cross in order to maintain sustainability, while taking into account that many of the decisions that drive what impact we have are very local decisions. And then in that context, the question of how formal and informal networks should develop if we want to achieve this exchange of information from the international level to the local level. And with that, I close the introduction and would like to hand over to Marie Stensike from Gothenburg University in Sweden to present the first presentation on the IPBES assessment.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to share my screen. Thank you for inviting me, though this was a bigger task than I was really prepared for. But I'm happy to do the presentation of Joseph Settele, and it's been a short notice. So this is largely Professor Settele's slides I will present. It's not the first time certainly I present the IPBES global assessment, but I have not been presenting on the from the perspective of cultural landscapes before, but Joseph has prepared this well for me. Joseph Settele, Professor Settele, was one of 3 co-chairs of the IPBES global assessment and did a great job in keeping together the big group that worked with it. My own role in IPBES is that I'm since 6 years, I've been the co-chair of the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES that has the role of oversee the scientific quality of IPBES products, and we also appoint the experts that are working in the assessments. So that is why I'm fairly familiar with also the global assessment. But bear with me that this is my interpretation of Professor Settele's slides. So the presentation will first be about the IPBES global assessment and kind of the components of it, and then go more into discuss cultural landscapes in relation to the global assessment. And for those of you who want to reach out to Professor Settele, here is his email address. There are certainly a number of questions that are answered by him than by me. The global assessment of IPBES was, as Stefan said, approved in 2019, May 2019. It was a large work that lasted for 3 years, involving 500 scientists. The whole assessment comprises of 6 chapters, all in all about 1,800 pages, and you can find it all on IPBES website that is publicly available. There's also a summary for policy makers on around 40 pages for those who want to kind of have a first and quick look. I mean, the summary for policy makers is more on a kind of publicly available language, you could say, while the 6 chapters are certainly have a lot of material that are of great interest for, I would say, researchers and looking in, since it is an synthesis of kind of the knowledge, but also an assessment of the quality of the knowledge. IPBES itself doesn't produce any new research, but it assesses the knowledge that is out there. And IPBES global assessment is based on 15,000 publications, both peer-reviewed publication and gray publications. And it also takes into account indigenous and local knowledge, and I will come back a bit to that, but that has been an important component, as also was mentioned before, in the work of IPBES. There is a process in our assessment in IPBES that is kind of 2 rounds of public reviews. So we have the first order draft going out for review, and then a second order draft. And in those 2 reviews, more than 20,000 comments were received on the material in these peer review occasions. And all of these has to, according to our rules and standards, be considered by the authors. So you see, the work for the scientists involved is not just to write and assess the knowledge, but also then to take into account and consider comments coming up. And by that, it's of course a way for IPBES to make this validate the knowledge into it. And that also gives the report a high credibility. In those ways of working, we largely follow the standards or the structure that IPCC, the climate panel, has been working with, and successfully so. The date of the kind of presentation of IPBES global assessment was not a coincidence, because it played into what kind of should have been the 2020 year of biodiversity, the 2020 goals of age targets of conventional biodiversity. Now that has been postponed, but still kind of it's followed since the pandemic has postponed everything, that it now goes into the scientific basis for the post 2020 biodiversity framework that will be discussed at the Conventional Biodiversity COP15 in October in Kunming in China, and then there is ongoing preparatory work, as I guess a number of you are also familiar with. So this plays into the kind of broader international global biodiversity initiatives and framings. Here's the team, or the core team, you could say, of the lead authors and the co-chairs and the chapter chairs of IPBES Global Assessment. So, of those you doesn't know Professor Settler, this is him, the slides I'm talking about. He was then cooperating with Professor Sandra Diaz from Argentina and Professor Eduardo Brundizio from Brazil, now working in US, and they were then supported by a technical support unit, he and Joe and Max Güse, and that technical support was based in Bonn, where the IPBES Secretariat is also based. So these are a big group, but still there were even more scientists that contributed it and other knowledge holders. So what did the report point at? I would not, of course, go through it all, but just some quick things that will also kind of relate to when it comes to country landscapes. Well, what IPBES has done is, first, I would say, to what we say broaden the tent conceptually, to discuss in terms of nature's contributions to people, which then includes ecosystem services, which might be a term that many of you are more familiar with. But the choice to instead have used nature contributions to people as a broader concept follows the logic that we would like to, or IPBES includes also other ways of, other worldviews, other ways of seeing the humans' relations to the rest of nature, and that didn't really fit into the more narrow interpretation that often follows with ecosystem services. I won't go into detail to that, but nature contributions to people is not instead of ecosystem services, but it kind of includes that, and partly reminds of it, of course. And in IPBES, the work that were based on this 18 categories of contributions to people, which and then it's also another perspective that's not mentioned here, that is more of a contextual way of seeing nature's contributions. But this is the generalizing perspective and is more similar to the ecosystem service framework, where it comprises a broad category of regulating contributions, fairly similar to regulating ecosystem services, material ecosystem contributions, and immaterial contributions or non-material contributions. Anyway, as you see, and looking on the 50 years trends, this is a very red and orange picture showing that almost all of these contributions has been decreasing over the last 50 years. Some very negatively developments and some fairly negative. Only 3 of them are pointing upwards, show green. At the same time, though, as they also have negative trends, it depends on what kind of, in this case, it is energy, food and feed, and materials that it concerns. So these 3 arrows point upwards is about the material contributions. So in the last 50 years, we have been able to take out more of materials from the world, from nature. At the same time, though, it has to be acknowledged that this is, of course, at the price of the cost is that has decreased the other contributions, and obviously then it's quite short-term gains if we at the same time lose in habitat creation, lose in pollination, in regulation of air quality, climate, and so on. so this picture to me shows that we have been very thinking short terms, but in the long term, we will lose also these point in green. What's not shown here, but it's very clear in other IPBES materials or in the full report, is that the gains is very unequally distributed also. So the gains has mostly come to Western countries, to developed countries, where we have had more food, more energy, more materials to consume, while it is people in more marginal areas, poorer countries, that have paid the price in losing the quality of their physical environment and losing contributions from nature when it comes to air quality, climate, and so on. So this also is a figure that has a kind of inequality dimension. That was about the contributions we get. If we look at species explicitly, there's a lot of materials or documents, research out there showing the decline of plants and animals. And IPBES report kind of clearly showed that 1 million species are threatened, 1 million species out of 8 million species. And this is based on various kind of groups, categories of animals and plants. And the red line here is the estimated percentage of threatened species. And this kind of speaks also to, or is in line with follows the red list that we produce in various countries. Looking at and now coming a bit closer to cultural landscapes, Joseph lifts out some kind of conclusion in the summary for policymakers, and the point here is that talking about biodiversity, we easily think of wild species, but certainly IPBES also includes domesticated plants and animals. And also when we look at the breeds and the local varieties of domesticated plants and animals, that variation is also disappearing or getting kind of narrower. We're losing the diversity in these dimensions. And that is a serious risk to global food security and much so more in some areas than in others, of course, of the world, but kind of that undermines the resilience of the agriculture system. With more varieties of plants and animals, we kind of have more chances to take account or handle catastrophes, or something happens with the pests or hazards, nature hazards, and so on. More wider variety of breeds makes our system more robust. But with when this is diminishing, we certainly put ourselves more at risk, makes ourselves more vulnerable. It's interesting to note that there has been efforts, of course, to keep the varieties, and that's not the least by indigenous peoples and local communities. Here's a figure that shows what we know of the risk of the domesticated species, plants and animals. As you see in this diagram, we know that a fair share is at risk, equally many not at risk. But the problem is we don't know. More than half of the species that we think is out there and the varieties, there's not knowledge enough to even assess if there is a risk or not. So we must not think that this at risk is just a fraction. The problem is that there's a knowledge gap here as well. We don't know to a large extent the risk for these species. And coming back to indigenous people and local communities, and those are groups that are under increasing pressure because with their livelihood and their physical environment is threatened, and it's diminishing in size. So that is the decline in their kind of area of living. And with the decline there, and with also that fewer and fewer can make a living in those areas, we also lose knowledge how to manage it, and in many ways how to take a sustainable management of those lands. This is a figure that on the contributions of indigenous people and local communities when it comes to knowledge, innovations, practices, and institutions. I should say that while indigenous peoples are, I shouldn't say perfectly, but there's a fairly recognized way of defining them. Not fully agreed. I'm aware of that. Who is local and what is local communities has been developed and thinking around that in IPBES since the global assessment, and it's I mean, since we're all in some sense local, but it's now kind of come to that this is mainly the way to frame traditional communities with, and then you of course can ask, what is traditional then? I mean, there's long-term history of outdoor recreation and in rural areas, but with long continuity and with kind of rural practices. Anyway, what these groups deliver, and when it comes to cultural ecosystems, that they're largely creating cultural landscapes with enhanced habitat heterogeneity. That is often what it looks like. And also developing production systems with a multitude of domestic and wild species. So what is a cultural landscape, as was said before, it's when human impacts. And it could be, of course, from all the kind of very urban areas where you see little traces of green to these intermix, integrated ways of, well, human and nature are very integrated, to areas where for a non-trained eye, you see this as very just nature, but for those living in these areas, they certainly can see how also these kinds of areas has been impacted by the people living in them. It's in the global assessment, and they estimated that about 25% of global land is kind of in areas where it had been traditionally used and is still to a large extent. And about 35% of highly conserved ecosystems and also 35% of protected areas are areas where kind of there are indigenous peoples that have some kind of or had traditionally used the areas, or there's areas that have been traditionally living in. And this, of course, to a large extent includes agrobiodiversity, but not only. In these areas where we have indigenous peoples and local communities, we can see that nature is declining less rapidly. At the same time, there is certainly a decline as well. And these areas are also increasingly under pressure. I guess these are, at least the decline there in the pressure is not really news from IPBES, but IPBES certainly highlights the situation in a very kind of valid way. When it comes to cultural landscapes, it is touched upon and described in some parts of the global assessment, and it has to be recognized that there are some high diversity cultural landscapes that are, well, the landscape themselves are diverse, and you can think of biodiversity is both at the gene, species, and kind of ecosystem level. So this speaks to the landscape level or ecosystem level of biodiversity, where these highly diverse cultural landscape is a complex mosaic of forest, wet, irrigated dry places, and also coastal habitats, which also opens for rich diversity of species and species varieties. These areas often have a long history of human-nature co-production. And there are some examples taken in the IPBES global assessment from the Mediterranean pastures in Spain, the Dehesas, but there are also, of course, in other parts of the world, and that we will hear later on, I presume, in this seminar. Also, it should be underlined that often these variety-rich areas are very species-rich, and they could even be more species-rich than the kind of the landscape not impacted by or less impacted by humans. So rather like hotspots. And the example given in the global assessment here is the hay meadows, or European hay meadows in the example here are from Hungary and from Romania, where there's been decades, but also centuries, many centuries of mowing the grass in a certain ways, which also have then caused a very rich variety. And the truth is then here that it's not a solution to abandon these lands. It won't be richer biodiversity, but these lands have to be kept managed in the way to keep its rich biodiversity, because it's created by this, it was co-produced by humans and the rest of nature. So Sepp, before we hand it over, we'll kind of put in a slide from my own country, from Sweden. So this is from an area called Brösarps backar in southern Sweden, in Scania, showing a very grazed landscape, but very, very species rich. And these are among the species rich land in my own country. It's important that these meadows and the grazed meadows, I would say, are unfertilized, very species rich. So when the nature protection government or agency in Sweden, I would say, flashes biodiversity, they often have a picture from these kinds of landscapes, not from some kind of more wild areas, but from these kinds of areas, because 35% of the red listed threatened species in Sweden belongs to these kinds of areas. So coming to the conclusions or the final words from Professor Zetterle is that feeding humanity and enhancing conservation are complementary and has to be kind of complemented by sustainable use. And the solution, the ways forward would be through sustainable agriculture, sustainable aquaculture, and sustainable livestock systems that safeguard the native species varieties and breeds and habitats. And this has to be promoted together then with, of course, climate change mitigation, reduced consumption among those of us that kind of have an overconsumption, avoiding food waste, and empowering producers and consumers to find more sustainable supply chains, and also supporting more healthy dietary choices. And this varies over the world, what this is, sustainable agriculture practices. Coming from the little cold part in the north of the world, I know that when you say we must eat much less meat, the grazing stocks, livestock are a problem. We know, as I'm not sure what is the situation in Japan, but in Sweden, we certainly need grazing animals to keep up the biodiversity, because otherwise the abandonment on land would decrease the number of the species riches in my country. So the final word from Professor Zetterle then is that recognizing the knowledge, innovations and practices, institutional values of indigenous peoples and local communities and their inclusion and participation in environmental governance. We should recognize that this enhances their quality of life, but it also brings about, or is positive for all of us, for nature conservation, sustainable use, and very relevant in that sense for the broader society. Now, the last pictures of Professor Zetterle's slide is about a certain project that other colleagues here has been working with. So I say thank you very much for this, and I leave now the word to others of my colleagues, to Stefan, to say something about this project.
Thank you very much, Marie, for this nice summary of key points from the global assessment of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which we call in short IPBES. And yeah, so Joseph started a project that had as one of the research sites an area in the northern part of Luzon in the Philippines. And I was lucky enough to become part of the project team there. And yeah, so I think what Joseph was intending to say here, that we have these really iconic cultural landscapes scattered across the globe, and that this area in northern Luzon, in the Ifugao province in particular, is also a World Heritage Site. And yeah, there we have these long traditions of intensive interactions between humans and these landscapes, and yeah, that they really symbolize very well what these yeah, efforts that humans have made over millennia really have created, and that is part of our heritage that we're now hoping to maintain through all these dramatic changes that we're experiencing. And yeah, Demi, did you want to, maybe, because you will be talking about it as well, maybe a little outlook on your own presentation later?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, thank you, Marie. So yeah, this is our the Ifugao rice terraces, and I think in this picture here, what we would like to show here is the interaction between the forests in the upper areas and the rice terraces where they plant rice. So we have here the agricultural system, and it's basically the forest basically sustains the agriculture in the rice terraces by providing nutrients and water. So I'll be discussing more about this in my presentation later. And that in the forest also, so we have a primary forest, which is basically the communal forest, and the forest here in the lower areas, these are secondary forests, or what we call muyong, and these are privately managed by clans in the community, and they have high biodiversity. So it's a complex system. Yeah, I think, thank you, Stefan.
Thank you very much. And yeah, to our listeners, I would like to mention that we're happy to take comments and questions through the Q&A function of Zoom, and that we would like to invite you to share your views, to ask questions, and ideally to help us with really finding the right addressees for your questions during the discussion period in the second half. If you could also mention, if you provide a question, to whom you would like to address it. So that just as a kind of little housekeeping announcement in between. So thanks again very much to Marie and to Demi, to the little outlook already. And yeah, now I would like to hand over to Flore Lafay-de-Michaud, and her presentation will be on the open-ended network of IPBES stakeholders. And so just for people who maybe are not yet really familiar with the idea that, well, IPBES as this UN body organizes the production of knowledge that is relevant to biodiversity, to ecosystem services, but to get the information to the level where it's needed for decision-making that helps with achieving more sustainable landscapes, more sustainable lifestyles. We need the interpretation and the transmission of this knowledge, and that's where the stakeholder networks come in. And so please, Flore, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm very pleased to be with you to share insights on the open-ended network of IPBES stakeholders, ONET, along with Marie. And in the next 5 minutes, I will try to make you understand what is ONET, where does it come from, and also why such a network, and where do you intend to go next. So I'll share my screen and my presentation. So I am Flore Lafay-de-Michaud. I am based in Switzerland at IUCN headquarters. I am IPBES coordinator, and I also support the ONET facilitation team. So just for clarification, in the context of IPBES, what do we mean by stakeholders? Stakeholders are the non-state members, because IPBES is a purely intergovernmental platform, so composed of about 139 state members, and the users or the contributors like authors, but also reviewers, and our IPES stakeholders. And in users, what we also understand is the people who will incorporate the IPES products into the practices, into the teaching, etc. And so here you've heard from Marie about the IPES Global Assessment that was published in 2019. And I wanted to also give you a glimpse of the other assessments that have been published so far by IPES. In 2016, one on pollinators, pollination and food production, and also a methodological assessment on scenarios and models of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Importantly, in 2018, there have been the publication of 4 regional assessments for Africa, for Europe and Central Asia, for the Americas, and for Asia and the Pacific. But importantly for our discussion today, I would like to highlight the land degradation and restoration assessment that was published also in 2018. So these are the published ones, but there are several assessments on the way. 2 are close to an end. One is about sustainable use of wild species, and the other one is about invasive alien species. But there are 2 ones that will start soon after the next IPES plenary in June, next June. And one is about transformative change, and the other one is about it is called the Nexus Assessment. That is an assessment that will study the interlinkages between biodiversity, food, water, health in the context of climate change. And I think here it appears clearly that knowledge, even beyond strictly academic knowledge, will be required in such transversal assessment. And here come, of course, the stakeholders. And this is even very much present in the IPES conceptual framework. This is a key framework because it guides all IPES products and all IPES assessments. And it is a strong recognition of the importance of multiple perspectives and values of nature. So here, for example, in blue, you have expressions and worldviews that are more close to indigenous and traditional communities. And in green, what is more used in classical biodiversity approaches about, for example, biodiversity and ecosystems, or ecosystem goods and services. So why stakeholder participation is important for IPES? Here there is a quote from Humberto Maturana from Chile. There is also the global understanding, as Stefan already mentioned, that we have to interpret this academic knowledge because this knowledge has to become in practice, has to come into practice, into practitioners' approaches, into policy makers' approaches and practices. And this is important to widen the community of people that are contributing to IPES processes. And this was exactly the understanding of several researchers, individual researchers, and also global conservation NGOs, like, for example, IUCN, even before the creation of IPES in 2012. And these people closely followed the creation of the platform and the making of its processes from its creation. And so ONET dates back to the creation of the platform, in fact, as this group of people gradually came to the idea of creating a network of stakeholders with the possibility to increase the representativity and the inclusion of stakeholders into IPES processes. And so the open-ended network of IPES stakeholders is self-organized, and its aims is to support the work program of IPES. The idea is to really enclose any profile from practitioners to even private sector representative and up to and to knowledge holders, and it defends the values of inclusive participation and transparency. And this is an image that was taken in a networking lunch in Paris in 2019 during the stakeholder days. I think that we are now 300 members of ONET, and the wish of ONET is to, of course, increase its membership to increase, in fact, representativeness of disciplines and also of regions, because there are still sub-regions that are less represented in the group. And Mary will tell you about the inclusion of more disciplines such as social sciences and humanities in the network. So the ONET's main objectives are to foster a two-way communication between network members and IPBES. So not only helping to disseminate IPBES products and to reach out to a great variety of audiences, but also to bring into the IPBES processes more diversity of information, data, knowledge, to increase the relevance and the further use of IPBES products. It also helps to mobilize resources for capacity building. That is one of the functions of IPBES. And also it encourages in-kind contributions from stakeholders in the field of capacity building, but it could be also in policy support tools. And in that regard, ONET is, along with the IAFBS, the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, these are the two networks that are helping IPBES Secretariat to prepare the stakeholder days. Stakeholder days are gatherings of all IPBES stakeholders a few days before the IPBES plenary. And the next stakeholder days will happen in from 3 to 9 June 2021, and they will be preceded by ONET Caucus Day on 31st of May. So I would like now to hand over to Mari to introduce us to SSH Network, who has just recently joined ONET. Mari, over to you.
Thank you very much, Flor. Yes, Flor asked me to join here because, well, it's timely to talk about the social science humanities when we discuss cultural landscapes. This is a network kind of originated from the external review of IPBES when it came to the end of the first work program of IPBES, where it was pointed out that IPBES were doing fairly well in working with the regional representation and the gender representation, but there still were shortcomings when it comes to the disciplinary representation and a shortage of social science and humanities. So that made some of us take the initiative and also together with the capacity building task force of IPBES start to draft kind of piloting discussions on how can we better engage social science, humanities, scholars and perspectives into IPBES. And after a year with seminars and discussions with colleagues on this, well, planned to be physical meetings, but we have had it virtual. We came to the conclusion the best way was to join as a sub network within ONET with kind of what was a set structure, and that could be then a platform for interactions between people like me that are engaged in IPBES, social scientists, humanities, scholars that would like to be part of IPBES, but also those that might want to stay out and do studies, conceptual studies, critical studies of us, but still kind of to interact and to communicate. Next slide, please. Flor? Yeah, thanks. So thinking what IPBES or the social science and humanities scholars and disciplines could offer to IPBES. I mean, one is that we need to better engage social science, humanities scholars, but also connected to that is to, if they come to IPBES, that would kind of, what do they bring and what are the implications? I mean, it's not so that there are ready boxes to enter, or there might be, but since IPBES has from the start been naturally a kind of biologically biased body, this was also contributing to advancing the work of IPBES, but also maybe kind of challenge some of the routines how we've been doing. And very relevant for cultural landscape, the social sciences and humanities can offer a more complex view of society and of societies and their physical surroundings. And that's often more context sensitive. For example, when it comes to discussion, the new concept of nature's contributions to people shows that people's ways of valuing what they get from nature varies. So what is a contribution for some could be a kind of disservice for somebody else. And this also varies between regions, between groups of people, and also between people living in the same area. And that kind of studies or knowledge or insights can be provided by humanistic and social science scholars, and also then of course contributing for the work of IPBES also to be in line with the Agenda 2030 and equity goals and things like leaving no one behind. Social science humanities play a variety of roles in IPBES, and this can be further improved. One is, of course, to become more conceptual governance, values issues, but it also have a role to play, and very much so when it comes to cultural landscape, when it comes to practices, the practical management, and understanding the kind of context in where the practices, the become very physical interactions between humans and the environment happens, and the logic behind that, and what need to be sustained, but also how to support more sustainable uses and how to engage various actors in these respects. For example, when we talk about local communities, social science humanities could also show the kind of changes, who is local these days and who are the actors today. I mean, it might not be the very old traditional society or communities that once were there, but there might be new actors that could, in the same way, uphold the sustainable use of pieces of landscape. I forgot to say that my own background is in human geography, and my core concept in my own research is landscape, and landscape as a kind of integrated concept for the interactions between humans and the rest of nature and other kind of non-human features. So we hope that this SSH network then will tap into existing professional societies and be an umbrella network where also could be smaller groups working with specific interests, but this could attract them. And I think from social science humanities scholars' perspective could show as a virtue of an organization like IPBES that there is within the frame of ONET a platform that you can have a critical discussion of issues you want to bring forward, and you do not have to sit in the various assessments to also kind of have this kind of arena. And just finally, my final slide, next slide, yeah, is to show one kind of application when it comes to cultural landscape, and that is within this frame of nature contributions to people and IPBES ongoing now assessment on values. What has been launched or stressed in IPBES work, that it is not just about intrinsic values, kind of the nature's values itself, or instrumental values that we can measure and kind of would mean about the same for us, but what is very important are these in the bottom here, the relational values that could be either kind of collectively shared in group or individually, that is about reflecting the importance of our relation to specific places, to specific areas, and to evolving that kind of thinking goes very much in line, I would say, also with the thinking and research when it comes to cultural landscape, when it comes to place identity, social cohesion, and such issues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, both Flo and Marie, for the introduction of these IPBES stakeholder networks. And Marie, what you said about the practice part, I think very nicely leads over to the next contribution by Yesenia Hernandez from Mexico. And her work focuses on biocultural protocols and the way that humans interact with their environment in this context. So please, Yesenia, let us share your presentation with us.
Yes. Good morning from Mexico. I am so happy to be here with you. Let me share my screen. For me, it's so important to be here because it's a good opportunity to work and to have a dialogue between you as an experts from Western science and me as a biologist and indigenous scientist. First, I would like to share with you some memories from many years ago in my village where I grew. This is my village called San Andres Guayapa. And for many years, I saw the change and the challenge of my surrounding landscape, the leaves of the trees and the flowers, the corn fields, and the people working on shaping and making anything, a lot of things in the landscapes and interacted with nature. And to make this, we base our management in the ancestral, traditional knowledge, innovation, and practices from our culture, Zapotec, from many millennia, not many millennia, a few millennia, and the new knowledge came from the Spanish people and other persons that came to Mexico. And all this interaction produce many things, and but the base always is and still going to still is the base is the interacting with nature and how we see the nature and the culture and the natural and people. And we interact with the beings, the natural beings, grandmother, the stones, the father, son, plants, animals. And also we always recognize that we are a part of the nature, not a different thing, the human of nature. And now, in this regard, we understand that the management of the cultural landscape is a practice that needs the experience and the expertise, but this expertise that goes that is as a product of the many years and centuries of working with and watching and management, testing, observing, working, and so on. And therefore, this knowledge and experience is crucial, is critical to maintain our cultural landscapes. And now, in this time, we can see some risk and challenge from cultural landscapes. The main is climate change, urbanization, cultural change, invasive alien species, land degradation, and biodiversity loss. Now, and how you say the colleagues that talking about spoke before me, and according with IPBES global assessment, indigenous peoples and local communities have made a good and sustainable management of the landscapes and territories, biodiversity, etc. And however, in this time, we need to work with other stakeholders and with the other sectors. And one of them is the Western scientists. We need to face the risk in finding joint solutions for this, for the current challenges. One example is the climate change. All the management of the landscapes, the cultural landscapes, is a long-term process, but we need fast solutions for adaptation and trying to mitigate this problem. And for this work, we can see some examples and some information about the importance of the traditional and local knowledge that comes from the observation and practicing. And for understand the management of cultural landscape, those are an important cultural landscape for us in Oaxaca, the Yagul and Mitla Caves, World Heritage Site, because it's the place where we have the oldest rest of agriculture in America. They are in Oaxaca. And West and indigenous have made a good management, but we have some challenge. This is example of land change use to ground agave. This plant is for make drinks like tequila and some sugar and other medicines. And for working with between indigenous peoples and Western science, fortunately, we have a lot of tools and new approaches. And in IPBES work, we know a lot of tools, but the main are the biocultural approach. That this is taking a lot of importance because we are changing our mind from working biologists and anthropologists, and we need to work together. And multiple evidence-based approach is a very important document and tool for IBES works, and also, of course, IBES framework that promotes the integration and the work between different knowledge systems for the functions, and something that is very important to me and for me and for all indigenous peoples that work with biodiversity is the approach to recognizing working with indigenous and local knowledge. I think is the first platform like IPCC and now IBES. Before IPCC is working with indigenous in a very seriously way, and socio-ecosystem, and documents about the possible elements of work in the links between nature and culture for the next post-2020 global biodiversity framework, worked between CDB and UNESCO, and co-producing knowledge and so much more. And now I would like to share with you my experience with the biocultural community protocols. As you know, they are instruments that set out the clear terms and conditions to the governments and private sector, research and non-profit sector to engage with indigenous and local communities for assessing the local resources and knowledge and work with the access and benefit sharing. And all other definition is terms that covers, array of expression, articulation, laws. And this is a very important definition because this is from CDB and is more seriously. The last one is more technical. But what is the importance of BCPs? BCPs helps to local people to recognizing the biocultural heritage that they need to protect and to promote, and recognize as a thing that is from the community, the region, the culture, and know or deeply the knowledge about the history, knowledge about the indigenous rights as the international conventions, national law, local law, and how to put them in the documents, and establishing rules to apply to stakeholders, for example, the universities that want to make research must to comply a lot of rules, such free prior consent. This is very important in order to prevent biopiracy, for example. And now, those are the 3 community protocols that all of them built the first macro-regional protocol in the world. And this is Mexico. Oaxaca is in a state that is in the south part. And it's very important because it's the richest state in biodiversity. And we can remember that Mexico is a megadiversity country. And Oaxaca is the richest state in cultural diversity. 16 different indigenous groups, and we have a lab of biocultural there. And these are the original landscapes with management, especially with wild agaves. But these landscapes are facing the land change use because the high demand of agave for making tequila, mezcal, and other drinks and medicines. Well, the outcomes of these BCPs, biocultural protocols, is the recognition of natural, cultural, and biocultural heritage, and the mandate to protect them. How we can to protect, for instance, if we want to take a design of the cloth, we must to obtain the free prior consent, and also make a mutually agreement to sharing benefits, and the recognition of special cultural elements, recognition of our rights and importance as indigenous peoples. We use the message from the global assessment the very strong message about the importance of indigenous for preserving, for conserving, and sustainable use of biodiversity and nature, and making rules that will apply not just for genetic resources, because the only document, binding document at international level that recognizes the BCPs, the biocultural protocols, is Nagoya Protocol, but we hope in the future more international agreements and declarations from United Nations recognizes the importance of BCPs, and making rules to maintain and protect the landscapes. For example, putting a maximum rate of the land change use for planting agave, and promoting the self-governance. And the question for this webinar, well, how to make cultural landscapes more sustainable. But I would like to invite you to think and to think about how in the local level we see and we make a good and rational management of cultural landscapes. And this could be an opportunity to make small leaps for sustainability by the activities to produce, maintain nature, contributions to people and culture, and process protecting nature and social processes associated. It's very important also to protect people and protect the rights to the land, to the territory, water, and biodiversity and genetic resources. Okay, finally, I would like to share the indigenous and local knowledge comes from years and centuries of experience, and this information can allow us to survive in our environment. This is the most important thing. If some of you came to my community and goes to the forest, maybe you don't know what are the poison mushrooms, but we know what are the edible mushrooms, and so on. We have a lot of examples about this, and we can survive in our environment, obtain benefits, contributions for our life, for our culture, and also we know that we must to maintain, to keep, to conserve our cultural landscapes in different ways, but always looking for conservation and sustainable use. Always, because landscapes is a source of our life, and if we don't have landscapes in a good under good management, we don't have any all the benefits that they give to us in this interaction. And also, indigenous and local knowledge is the main source of information. All the people that wants to work with cultural landscapes must go and make exploration in the local knowledge and local practices and innovations, and for understand how this cultural landscape works and how we can improve or making more sustainable, and also facing the challenges that we are facing, face the challenges that the current challenges, and about the how management, and it's the first information to have immediately a picture about the how is the interaction between nature and humans working to produce, to maintain. And finally, the BCPs, the biocultural community protocols, are a good tool to improve the local and regional interest, to establish measures to protect the cultural landscapes, the biocultural heritage, and all the elements of this very big network that maintains the territories. And Stiushibu, that means thanks in Zapotec, and this is my email account. And thank you so much again for this opportunity to have a dialogue with Western science.
Thank you so much, Yesenia, for this very nice overview of your work and the role that the tool of biocultural protocols play in the drive for really achieving sustainable landscapes. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, so I would like to invite now Maiko Nishi from the United Nations University to give us the presentation about the Satayama Initiative and its international partnership for yet another more global view on cultural landscapes. So please, Maiko.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for giving me the opportunity to talk about the work on cultural landscapes under the Satayama Initiative. Okay, so our institute, as part of the United Nations University, has been engaged in policy-oriented research and also capacity development on the issues related to sustainability. And here we have been hosting the Secretariat of the International Partnership for the Satayama Initiative, IPSI, since 2010, when the 10th conference of the party to the Convention on Biological Diversity was held in Nagoya, Aichi in Japan. So I'd like to share some experiences in working with the diverse stakeholder to maintain and also revitalize cultural landscapes through the Satayama Initiative, and also reflect some challenges and opportunities to move forward. So the Satayama Initiative was jointly initiated by United Nations University and also the Ministry of the Environment, Japan. And it has become a global effort to realize societies in harmony with nature, which is the vision of the Satayama Initiative. And from the sixth perspective of integrating ecological and socioeconomic dimensions of landscape, we've been taking threefold approach, including consolidating wisdom on securing diverse ecosystem services and values, and integrating not only traditional knowledge, but also a modern science and technology in the landscape management. And also exploring new forms of co-management to maintain and foster the landscapes as a new kinds of commons. So with this approach, the main objective of the initiative is to promote revitalization and sustainable management of socio-ecological production landscape and seascapes called SEPOs from around the world. So this, the concept of socio-ecological production landscape and seascapes, SEPOs, is the core concept of the Satayama Initiative. And we define it as areas where production activities like agriculture, forestry, fishery have to maintain, support biodiversity and ecosystem services, and at the same time support our livelihood and well-being of the local communities. And one of the key features of these SEPOs is the mosaic of habitats and also land use and sea uses, involving the dynamic human-nature interactions. And as a result of such dynamic processes, it supports biodiversity and also provide people with goods and services needed for well-being and leading to mutual benefits for human and nature. So these kind of landscape and seascapes can be found in many parts of the world, differently called in local terms and also different languages. And they are very much embedded in the specific local context, particularly in relation to various forms of resource use activities. So in this regard, so these landscape and seascapes are deeply involved, linked to the local culture and knowledge. So to implement this concept and also the approach, the International Partnership for the Satayama Initiative, IPSI, was launched during the CBD COP10 in 2010. And this is a global platform to promote networking and also collaboration on the management of SEPOs, and particularly intended to contribute to the CBD's second objective, which is the sustainable use of biodiversity. And having started with the 51 founding member organization, this partnership has evolved and now consists of 271 member organizations, including national, local governments, NGOs, private sector organizations, and academic institutions, and importantly, indigenous peoples and local communities who are dedicated to work together to realize the vision of the Satayama Initiative. So it also aims to foster the synergies in the implementation of the activity of these member organizations. So the IPSI membership has continuously increased over the past decade, and the largest share of the members are NGOs and followed by academic research institutes. And so we have been quite successfully increasing the number of organizations, but we also have some challenges. So some of the members are very active, but others are not so much. And in terms of their participation and collaboration. So it's also a challenge to think about how to actually reactivate and motivate those member organizations. So, and also serving as a secretariat, we have been also collecting the case studies from member organization. So many of the cases are rural landscapes, like our agriculture, forest, ecosystems are dominant, but also we have some cases on the coastal landscape and also even urban and peri-urban landscapes. And we have been sharing and disseminating the information and knowledge on those case studies through website, newsletter, and publication. In particular, since 2015, we have been publishing a series of case study compilation. So the strength of IPSI is the collection and also a dissemination of the on the ground, the knowledge and information derived from the on the ground activities, and also making them relevant to the policy processes by synthesizing the case study finding. And so as a secretariat, we have been conducting mainly three kinds of activities, like organizing global conferences, regional workshops, and also side events at the margin of the key international processes like CBD. And also, as I mentioned, we have been serving as an information platform to collect and share the case study information and also other relevant knowledges. And also, we have been promoting the collaborative activities to strengthen the cooperation and synergies among the IPSI member organization. So just to introduce some of the collaborative activities, which now amounts to over 51 projects, I just pick up a few of them where particularly the Secretariat has been heavily involved. The first one is the Satoyama Development Mechanism. This is a financing scheme to support local organization like community-based resource management and capacity development. So, so far we have supported 60 seed funding projects since 2013 in cooperation with the Ministry of Environment Japan and also Institute for Global Environmental Strategy, IGES, research institute based in Japan. And the next is the toolkit for the resilience indicators, which is a set of 20 indicators to measure the resilience of the sepals in a participatory manner. So this toolkit was developed in cooperation with UNDP, IGES, and Biodiversity International. And this project has been already completed, but the toolkit as a product also has been used particularly through the third project, Community Development and Knowledge Management for the Satoyama Initiative, COMDEX. So this is another kind of financing scheme to support a community organization to develop biodiversity and livelihood strategies. And this project has been implemented by UNDP as a JEF small grant program in partnership with the Ministry of the Environment Japan and also CBD Secretariat. So having reviewed some the decade effort of our working together with diverse stakeholders under the Satoyama Initiative, we also see various challenges to move forward. In particular, the IPSI case study demonstrate very good practices, mostly at the local level, but they are yet to fully bring about system-wide radical change. So we can see them as seeds of change towards a transformative change. So, but in order to make a real transformative change happen, there are also challenges at the level of enabler to make a decision for change and also actions to implement the decision. So for enabler, it's often difficult for stakeholders to fully recognize the complex problem of the cultural landscapes due to its complexity and also interlinked and dynamic nature. And also the technical and financial capacities are disproportionately available to a different stakeholder, particularly insufficient for those who are vulnerable. So this impedes some are informed and also equitable decision making. And also the authority over landscape management, like our decision making power and also our rights to control and access resources, is often inequitably granted or unclearly defined. So this also impedes some equitable or legitimate decision making. And also for the action, the level of a commitment to the decision also are various among different stakeholders, depending on their different interests and needs. And this also disallows some concerted efforts among the different stakeholders. And also lack of financial and technical capacity also delay or impede the implementation or enforcement of the decision that has been made. And also, so as I mentioned, there are also challenges in mobilizing the IPUS network. So it's important to reactivate and motivate some of the members who are not so much active for their participation and collaboration. And also the case study has been collected actually mostly through the one-time submission from the members. So it's important to follow up the IPSI case studies for their longer term monitoring evaluation to more learn from the local activities and also contribute to the policy recommendation. So, but we have also some potentials and opportunities, and particularly the Satayama initiative offer the key concept involving the value of secondary nature and biocultural diversity. And this is very relevant to the 2050 vision for biodiversity, which is living in harmony with nature, and well resonated with the vision of the Satayama initiative. And along with these lines, so it's also possible to contribute to the international processes like CBD and IPFES and other international processes through mobilizing diverse stakeholders at multiple levels, and also their expertise, and also extending the lessons experience learned from the on-the-ground activity to the global goals. And the concept also is relevant to some of the national and regional policy. So it would also help to mainstream biodiversity across different sectors within the country or region. And also by taking advantage of academic resources at UNU, particularly the scholarly and also policy relevant networks. So we hope to more effectively support diverse activities on the landscape management from different parts of the world, building on the practical and experiential knowledge, and also the partnership that has been evolving over the past decade. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this overview of the activities of the Satayama Initiative and its international partnership. That was really fascinating and also encouraging to see that there are lots of opportunities for positive engagement and options for overcoming the challenges. Thank you very much. So I would like to now invite Professor Brice Saint-Saëns from Abomey-Calavi University in Benin to give his presentation on the way that historical ownership impacts protected area management. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Stefan. My name is Brice Saint-Saëns from the University of Abomey-Calavi in Benin, and I'm very, very happy and thank the organizers for this webinar, which allow me to show you what is happening on the ground as far as a landscape is concerned around the protected area. I'm forester by background, and I passed many years working in protected areas and the challenges around it. So I want just to present how cultural landscape ownership, how this community around the protected areas in West Africa are seeing the change from the traditional ownership to the national, the state rule that manage a part of the traditional landscape. So that is my talk, and thank you. This is just to highlight where is the Benin and who are we. It is in West Africa, 12 million of people. Our official language is French. So far, there are 50 languages locally spoken. And you can see the map here is our protected areas network. In this northern part, it is the national park that we have in Benin. And my talk will turn around this. So here is a community around the protected area in Benin. What is a protected area for natural resource conservation. But around this protected area, you have many cultural aspects for land use, meaning agriculture, meaning livestock breeding, fishing, and many others, and also architectural aspect also can be seen, and how population livelihood can be viewed on this ground. Definitively, let's say that in the past, people use landscape partly for their production, the agricultural, the livestock breeding, but also partly for gathering, for harvesting wild product, what we can call here ecosystem production services. So how do it we come to that? You know, in the past, the colonial authorities used to, let's say, negotiate these lands with a local community, because they have their property rights on their land. And also on this common land, they use to hunt wildlife, to fish, and to collect other resources. So it is a kind of common management of this community lands. But you know, when it's come to protect parts of the countries, colonial authorities are used to negotiate, in some cases fairly with local communities, to establish national protected areas. But also in certain areas that was done by force. So people are constrained to leave their land as far as colonial authorities saw that this land house abundant wildlife. So it is qualified to be gazetted. So when it comes to that, you know, they lose all rights on it for national concern. And in no case, there is no compensation during this process of gazetting and protected area. And you can see that that will create some conflicts. So the new colonial land ownership, what we call the modern land tenure rule, was definitively opposed to the traditional rule. So as far as this kind of portion of land was protected, nobody can go to harvest any resources that occur on the former lands. And that is a big challenge and conflictual situation that nowadays foresters have to deal with. So as I say that moving from the colonial authorities to now the local acting authorities that have a responsibility of managing this protected area. It is a kind of managing conflict situation around protected areas. So because government didn't succeed in really giving to local population what they expect from this kind of protecting and managing protected area, we come to the so-called co-management. Everybody is understand that it is very important that we have to manage all of these areas with the local communities in order, let's say, to have a kind of a peace around this area, just because government never succeed in improving it. But problem come with the issue and also the output of this co-management, because more and more local community are given much more power in this kind of co-management. Then besides this opportunity to recover the land ownership that was lost by the father and the grandfather in the past, because of the new position of a decision position, this local community now recover. They view this protected area, which are national concern, as a local asset for them. So they find it as another way to recover what the grandparent lost. And more claiming of this new land ownership is reflects in the way they see the other ethnic group. For them, it is any job should be the priority of the local communities. Just by so doing, to recover all of the ownership that they are claiming, and that is a very big challenge. What we are working on is how we can increase good governance, which let's say was not very well applied in the past, in order to avoid all the bad aspects of the bad governance. Because when you in co-management and you don't have a very relevant, effective governance, what happens is that you have to recruit locally, but no skilled workers. And you have to give them a staff position. And in this position, they don't improve the good governance that was needed for protected area management. So I really to do good co-management, but also in the view of national concern is the challenge of protected area managers on the ground today. So our working hypothesis is that we should move to have a good governance inside co-management, because definitively local population have to do have some responsibility in managing protected area in the locality. So if we in some area where we succeed in doing good management, for sure, we notice a very good return on investment, and that benefits to everybody in the at national level. So that's what I want to share with you, our challenges as a protected areas manager in a co-management system, and also how far you have to give let's say to assure local communities, but also to target national communities in order to have a good man at the good place, in order to have a good return for everybody at national level. Thank you. It is a few talk I want to share with you. Thank you very much, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Brice, for sharing these insights from Benin. And yeah, it's really a big challenge to combine these local aspects and the national level together with the very difficult colonial history. And yeah, so I hope that in international networking, there may be good ideas about how to take these issues further in a very constructive way. So thank you for sharing these insights with us.
Thanks so much.
So I would like to move on to the last presentation of our webinar, and I would like to invite Professor Damasa Makandok from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, who will talk about the rice fields and the traditional cultural landscape management in Ifugao. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and also thank you very much for inviting me to share our findings, our research, also in one of the cultural landscapes in northern Philippines. And good evening from the Philippines. I know in other parts of the world, it could be good afternoon or good morning. Okay, so the topic that Stefan asked me to present is entitled Applying Scientific Knowledge for the Sustainable Management of Cultural Landscapes, the case of Muyong Payo system in the Ifugao region of Luzon, Philippines. So in my first slide here, I'm just showing you the Muyong, that's the secondary forest above these rice terraces, which is locally termed as Payo. Okay, so this is map of the northern Philippines. This is the Cordilleras region, and Ifugao is somewhere here, the pink one. So the Cordillera mountain range are high elevation, steep mountainous areas, and here in the Ifugao, and even in the mountain province, in the neighboring province, we have these rice terraces that are curved along the sides or hills of the mountains. And this Ifugao rice terraces is one of the UNESCO World Heritage, and it is a showcase of blending of the physical, sociocultural, economic, religious, and political environment. So as shown in the picture here, we have these rice terraces, high elevation, and then we have here the secondary forest, the Muyong. Okay, these rice terraces were built around 2,000 years ago, and that you can see that the walls of the terraces were built out of, in some areas it could be stones, whereas in the picture here we have mud wall. And these rice terraces were curved along the natural contours of the hills and mountains. And this terrace system also featured an intricate irrigation system, as shown in the picture here on the lower right. So this is one terrace up here, and then you can see there's a canal here that and through this canal the water trickles now from the upper terraces to the succeeding terraces. But actually this water would come from the forests in above these rice terraces. So it's basically harvesting, it's an indigenous knowledge of harvesting water from the mountains. So not only the secondary forest above the terraces, but also the communal primary forests from much higher elevation. So we have the Muyong forest, or the secondary forest, and we have the rice terraces, the Payo terraces, and the Muyong forest supplies water and also nutrients from the decomposing leaf litter in the forest, and it also provides stability to the Payo terraces. However, okay, land conversion, as you can see in the picture here, some of the forests have been converted into residential areas. Okay, so you can see some houses. It's because of population pressure. There is an increase in the number of residents in the local communities through the years. Okay, and then of course some of the forest areas have been converted into terraces. There are some new terraces right here in this spot, and also for agriculture areas like for example planting of vegetables. And this land use conversion and the increase in residential development have impacts in the ecosystem. Like for example, there is a lower release of nutrients because of the change in the structure of the forest, because later on there was also introduction of other non-native species in the forest when they were reforested beginning in the 1990s. Okay, so to understand these dynamic interactions, we conducted participatory approaches with members of the local community. So we invited around 30 participants from 2 barangays, Poitan and Amganad. And the different activities that we conducted are timeline. So we wanted to determine the changes in land use of both Muyong and Payo system. And then we also asked them to draw their land use map through the years. So that's a community-based land use map. And then we also asked them to draw resource flow map as shown in this picture here. Okay, so what are the different resources that are coming from the forest and from the rice fields? And then causal mapping. So this one is what are the perceived environmental problems that they have, and what are their ideas about such environmental problems. And then we also have transect mapping and SWOT analysis. Okay, so this is an example of the result of the timeline. So most of the participants that attended, they can still recall way back in the 1940s, so that was during the Second World War. And so the pink lines here would be the events that took place for both barangays Amganad and Poitan. The red one would be events that took place only in Barangay Amganad, and the blue one would be for Barangay Poitan. So since the 1940s, shifting cultivation was practiced by the local communities. Shifting cultivation, this is clearing of small patches of forest, and then they will do agriculture without fertilizer application. And then after a few years, the productivity of that patch of forest or of that shifting cultivation farm will decline. So they will leave that patch to fallow for a few years for the soil to recover and for the vegetation to grow back again. And then maybe after 10 or 20 years, they will go back to that one. So they always keep on shifting. So it was practiced way back in the 1940s. And they also said that way back then, from the 1940s to 1970s, the Muyong has very thick forest. So let me say it's very rich in diversity, and they still have plenty of trees. But since the 1940s, forest is also an important source for wood, for their shelter, for their homes. Okay. And then starting in the 1950s, because Ifugao is a famous tourist area, the rice terraces, there are so many tourists going there. So wood carving is also a lucrative business. So and the source of wood would be from the Muyong forest. So that started way back in the 1950s in Barangay Amganad, and starting in the 1970s in Barangay Poitan. Okay. Because through the years, they've been cutting trees for shelter and for wood carving. So the trees in the forest declined. So the government started reforestation programs starting in the 1990s. And in these reforestation programs, they introduced exotic species like Chimelina, mahogany, and almus species. And later on, pine and paper trees were also introduced in the reforestation programs. This next one would be the timeline for the payo, the rice terraces. So way back in the 1940s, they are planting up to the present time that we conducted the study. They were planting the native rice varieties they call Tinawan rice. But then again, new rice varieties were also introduced way back in the 1950 and also in the 1990. And then other species were also introduced in the terraces, in the paddy fields, such as mudfish, Japanese fish, shells, and golden snail, the purpose of which is to increase productivity for food. But then we know the historic, the classical story about the golden snail being invasive in the area. And then so earthworm was observed way back in the 1950s, and then problem again emerged after 1990s or year 2000. And then way back or starting in the 1990s, they had problems of insect pests, rats, golden snails, rice diseases, and earthworm in the rice paddies. Sweet potato was also planted since the 1940s. It is also one of the staple foods. So rice and sweet potato are staple food of the local communities. And since the area has high elevation, so it has cooler temperature, so temperate vegetables like carrot, cabbage, and are commonly grown in these agricultural areas, and they are marketed in the lowlands, like in Metro Manila. And then ecological and cultural problems started to observe the ecological and environmental problems starting in the 1990s. So that's for the timeline. And this one is just a visual representation of the changes in the land use every decade from 1940s to the present one. So in the 1940s, so you can see their dwellings will still the native nipa huts, and then there's still lush trees in the forest, and they have already the rice terraces because they were built 2,000 years ago. And then the 1950s, 1970s, now you can see that there are now modern style of dwellings, of houses. 1970s to 90s, now there are more houses because of the increase in the population in the area. And you would notice that there is a decline in the density of trees in the forest. And then this is the present one with electricity and with more vehicles traveling in the area. We asked them also to draw a transect map. So from the Muyong forest. So this is the actual picture of the barangay, and this is their illustration. So they have a good understanding, and they know the geography of their area. High elevation areas around 1,200 meters above sea level. We have here the different tree species in the Muyong forest, and then they would have some rice terraces there, and then they have the community somewhere in the middle, then more rice terraces going downhill, down to 990 meters, and then more houses below and more terraces. So this is a typical geography of the area. Now this is an interesting output. We asked them to draw a resource flow map of resources from the forest, from the rice terraces, and then the households and the market. So basically, organic pesticides, wood for dikes, and water, they come from the forest, and that goes to the rice terraces. Okay. Medicinal plants and firewood and lumber, they go to the household. So they collect their firewood from the forest. The wood for carving goes to the market because that is used for their carvings that is being sold to tourists. Ornamental plants and fruits also are being sold to the market. Okay. In the rice terraces, they grow rice, and most of the rice that they harvest is mainly for household consumption. So you just go to the farm. And then they also grow root crops, and then fish that they can catch in the rice paddies. The fish would either be consumed, or if there is excess, then they can sell it in the market. Edible shells also are collected in the rice paddies for consumption and also for marketing. They also grow vegetables, and most of them are for marketing. Now, from the household, they have farm labor and management that go into the rice. So they have them. And then they have also forest management that go into the Muyong forest. So they have a good understanding of the flow of resources and labor within the system. And then for this portion, for this causal map, we ask them what are the problems that they perceive in the Muyong and in the Payo. Okay. The major problem that they say in the Muyong is less trees. Why? Because they cut trees, because they need trees for wood carving, for housing, for firewood, and for lumber. And since there are less trees, they say that there are fewer birds that they can see now. So they understand the impact on biodiversity. And then because there are less trees, there are more open areas in the forest. And so that was an opportunity for grass to grow. And then because there are less trees and there are more grasses, they observe that there is an increased soil erosion from the forest. In the Payo, they said that their main problem would be the poor rice growth or the low rice yield. And they say there are a number of factors. Foremost would be the lack of water. And this is because there are less trees in the Muyong forest and there is erosion. So there's less water that would be used as an irrigation for the rice fields. Another problem that they have observed would be the earthworms. They say that because of the earthworms, some of the terraces eroded. And so again, this contributed to lack of water. They also observed pests and diseases starting in the 1990s. Okay, and then since there is poor growth or low rice yield, they have to look for other sources of income. So, and that would be the off-farm income. And that would mean that there is less farm labor that is available for their rice terraces, okay. And because they are not there in the farm, sometimes it results to late transplanting. So the cropping calendar has been affected, and this also affected the low rice yield because they do not have any other source of irrigation but the water that is coming from the Muyong forest. Okay. And then since sometimes some of them, if they don't have enough farm labor, they try to hire other members of the community to work for their farm. And so that is another expense for them that would result to lower net income. Another problem that they have mentioned would be poor rice growth due to zinc deficiency due to continuous submergence of the rice fields. Okay. And then the next one would be, with these environmental problems, what do they think would be the possible solutions? So these are the results from the two communities. Problems in the Muyong, from Barangay Amugana, they say less trees, soil erosion, less wildlife, lack of government support. And for the solution for these problems in the Muyong, they say reforestation using indigenous tree species. Barangay Powitan has also the same problem: natural calamities, less trees, soil erosion, damaged water pathways for irrigation. So they need to have tree planting. So both of them realize they need to reforest their Muyong. In the Payo, okay, presence of pests and diseases, poor irrigation, soil erosion, lack of labor. And they say seminars and training on integrated pest management, organic farming, and biological control are what they need. Okay. As for the farmers from the another barangay, from Poitan, their problem of earthworms, poor irrigation, damaged walls, lack of labor, what they need would be the use of pesticides. So they need to repair their damaged terraces, and they need to use tractors and micro-tillers for labor substitute. Okay. Now, another part of our project was about the sunflower, because when I was traveling around Ifugao and Mountain Province, I would notice that some of the farmers, they would be carrying cuttings of a sunflower. And so I asked them, what's that for? And they say it's because they use that as organic fertilizer. So in this picture here, so during land preparation, that is about 2 months before transplanting rice, they would cut trees, they would cut sunflower from neighboring areas, and they step on it to incorporate the sunflower in the soil. And so 2 months after, then they will transplant the rice seedlings. So what they did was to investigate on the effect of the sunflower on soil fertility and the growth of rice. So in one experiment, we just laid out, okay, this 1 meter by 1 meter plots, and this the plastic, we submerge it up to about half or 30 centimeters below the surface. So we really confine the water and the soil within this plot. So we have here 12 plots. That is for 4 treatments, 0, 500, 1,000, and 2,000 kilograms of fresh sunflower cuttings that were placed in there. And then we monitored these ones. So they were arranged in 4 replicates for each treatment, randomized complete block design. And so this is the photo documentation of the composition of the sunflower. So we have here 0, 500, 1,000, 2,000. This is 0 week. That's when we set up the experiment, and every 2 weeks we came back there in our experimental site. We took pictures, we took water samples and soil samples. And so you will notice by month 4, there's almost a complete decomposition of sunflower. And in another experiment in the open field, so in the actual rice fields, in the rice terraces, we just tried to apply sunflower. So you can see we have here sunflower and another plot without sunflower. And then we tried to monitor the biomass, the growth, and then the yield of rice. Okay. And then the scientific study of sunflower decomposition confirmed that the traditional practice of applying green manure, that is the sunflower, does improve soil conditions and rice yields. Okay. And then, so therefore, the local management practices that they are doing have scientific basis. I was not able to present to you the changes in pH, organic matter, nitrogen, phosphorus. We have those data, but due to consideration of time, so I just jumped into the summary and conclusion. Okay, another conclusion that we have from this study is that local ecological knowledge is important in the sustainable management of the Muyong Payo system, a cultural landscape in this case study. And participatory approach is effective in creating trust and openness among the stakeholders. And with that, I would like to thank you. And this project was funded by the National Research Council of the Philippines. The project was entitled Nutrient and Water Dynamics, Plant Biodiversity and Agricultural Productivity of Muyong Payo Systems in Banawe, Ifugao. And we would like to thank also the local communities of Barangays Amganad and Pawitan and the local government of Banawe, Ifugao for their cooperation in the conduct of this study. Thank you very much. Back to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Demi, for this really nice overview of the functioning of that traditional cultural landscape in Ifugao, and the way that local people are including like knowledge that you as scientists generate in the management of those systems. We unfortunately have used all the time that we had for our webinar, so we don't really have time for discussion. But I would like to invite Flo to maybe provide a little outlook on what is planned for further activities of ONET, and also Maiko Nishi to maybe say a few words about the perspective of what is in the pipeline, basically for the international partnership of the Satayama Initiative, to provide some outlook on what possibilities for engagement might be there in the near future.
So yes, thank you, Stefan, and thank you to all the panelists for really insightful presentations and really wonderful examples and cases. So I would like just to mention the upcoming events for ONET and for the IPBES stakeholders. There will be ONET Caucus Day on 31st of May, and more information is available on the ONET website, onet.ipbes.net. I can put the link just later in the chat box. And importantly, the stakeholder days of IPBES that will take place from 3 to 9 June, and you can also register on the IPBES website. So thanks to you, Stefan, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so maybe also a few words for the Satayama Initiative and the international partnership, and what you see as the key things for the near future, where people might also be able to contribute.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the interesting presentation and also opportunity to share the experiences and lessons learned from our activities. So we are now currently following under the negotiation process of developing the new global biodiversity framework for the post-2020 period. And as one of the IPSI collaborative activities, for example, we've been also developing a technical manual to assess CBD parties to integrate or incorporate and implement landscape approaches to the national biodiversity and strategies and action plans. So we are also trying to bring some of the kind of conceptual and also theoretical approach on the cultural landscape to the level of the policy making processes. So, and we are also developing the new action plans for the Satayama Initiative. And so as I mentioned, so there are also challenges to further mobilizing the diverse stakeholder at the different levels, and also extending the knowledge and also lessons learned from the on-the-ground activities to the global goal. So we are hoping to also further effectively serve as an intermediary to link up the different activity across different levels and sectors. Yeah, thank you very much for this insightful webinar.
Thank you very much. And yeah, so it's up to me to say thank you again to all the speakers, and thank you to all who have listened in. And I saw that there were questions related to making the material available. The webinar has been recorded, I hope successfully, and that it will be made accessible. The recording will be accessible through the website for the webinar. Elena, would you have any more concrete information on that, like when to start looking for it? Or
we will inform all absentees and attendees and all of you of the panelists with the link when the recording will be posted. So we will just send you an email. But normally it takes kind of 5 days. If it's between the weekend, maybe a bit more. But in 3 or 5 days, we will have it online. Okay?
Perfect, yeah.
And before we go, I would also like to thank you, Stefan and Tomohiro, for chairing the sessions, all the panelists for your presentations, and all the attendees for joining us today. And well, if that's all, I can close the webinar. I don't know if you want to say anything else, Stefan, or any one of you.
Well, maybe just at the end, another reminder that anybody who is working on cultural landscapes, and in particular in an interdisciplinary way that looks at sustainability issues related to cultural landscapes, we would be very happy to consider manuscripts for the special issue in the journal Land. Okay. That would be all from my side for today. Thank you.
Perfect. So again, thank you all, and stay safe, take care, and goodbye to everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.